Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. As we're heading towards the end of the 8th year in the Syrian civil war, it appears as if the end of the game is about to begin, with the Russians, Americans, Iranians, Turks, and Israelis, among others, all having a role to play. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Yeah.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Zev Khanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Bar-Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments vis-a-vis the Syrian conflict.
Even in the Middle East, with its special features, Syria is a unique case in its 8-year civil war, with Bashar Assad able to withstand all of his opponents. And you mentioned East and West. In Syria, it's the other way around. The Americans are east of the Euphrates River, fighting the Islamic State. They are also in the south, around a place called Tanef, which borders Jordan, while the Russians are west of the river, and especially on the Mediterranean coast, where they have a naval base at Latakia and an air base at Khamimim, and they are more and more entrenched there, while the Americans seem to want to go home. So they are now negotiating, both the Americans and the Russians, but also each of the coalition heads, so to speak, within their groupings in order to get some sort of a peace formula in Geneva, or at least present it in Geneva, even though it will be drafted elsewhere. And as we are speaking, while the Americans have not considered, the Russians seem to have the upper hand.
Dr. Boms?
Well, the Syrian war began as an uprising, as a part of the Arab Spring. It continued to be a civil war, an ethnic war, a proxy war, but soon enough it became a major arena of confrontation between the regional powers. And here, the East-West analysis and the topic of our program really comes into play. The war had attracted different players from the region and beyond, and soon enough it attracted the Russians in and also the Americans in, and in many ways they're still there. It also attracted the Iranians in, which is an issue that certainly is of concern to Israel as well as to Jordan as well as to the Americans. And really, when we say that Assad had won the war, it's really not exactly that he had won it. The war was won for him by the Axis, the powers that has been to his side. So really, when we're looking at the end of the Syrian war, we are actually beginning to look at new chapters. Perhaps it's the post-Syrian war, perhaps it's the de facto emergent reality in the region. But in that sense, that war is not entirely over. There are still American forces inside Syria, there are still Turkish forces inside Syria, there are Iranian forces inside Syria, there are Russian forces inside Syria. All of those have not really been there, certainly not with that extent before the war. And therefore, the conflict, the Syrian conflict that so far had sent over 7 million Syrians away from their country, had killed probably close to 1 million, depending who you ask, really is not entirely over.
Professor Khanin?
Well, in fact, as Nir and Amir said, Syria is actually an area of the conflict of the regional powers, but also it's a conflict of the superpowers. Two superpowers that were mentioned, Russia and the United States, or United States and Russia, all of them define or interpret the situation and the results in the field on the ground in a different way. Russians, as we heard several times, informed us that the war is over, and with the decisive victory of the Russia and their allies. Americans several times told us that the war not over, it's even not started, the real war. I mean, now it's time to start a decisive war against another groupings of the coalitions of the new enemies. In fact, that means, as colleagues said, and I agree with that it's, to be continued. On the other hand, we have to take into consideration another country, which is also between East and West, which is Ukraine. And it's very much related to what is going on in Syria. We understand that there is the proxy war in Ukraine, which is undertaken by the Russian proxy, that means East Ukrainian successors, and their armies are actually stopped. And in fact, we are going to have a very long like frozen conflict, another one in Eastern Europe. And now we time and again hear that now Russians are ready to speak with Americans in order to exchange the situation in Syria for the situation in Ukraine. A couple of years ago, it was unimaginable. At the moment, people more and more talking about that it could be like a package deal. So now we are curious to know what we are talking Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Vladimir Putin by standing in their recent meeting, and what was the conclusion of the talk between President Putin and President Trump. But probably we'll know about that in a couple of days.
You're talking about the meeting that was held not on the sidelines, but literally in the summit, peace summit in Paris,
yeah.
which brought about a short or a brief conversation about the situation. Mr. Oren?
Well, the Paris meeting was probably more about setting up a real meeting in which to talk things over, because what you had there was only Netanyahu, Putin, and an interpreter for a few minutes. And this was done because Netanyahu earlier said that he will cancel his participation in Paris if there is no meeting with Putin. So he saved face by at least having a meeting to talk about the meeting. Now, when the Russians intervened in Syria 3 years ago, it was simplistically interpreted as they are coming into the help of their friend Bashar Assad. But it was the other way around. What the Russians had in mind was a Kaliningrad on the Mediterranean. They wanted an enclave of their own with naval and air and missile facilities, but for that they need a friendly regime that will invite them to come in and to stay, so they will be there not against the wishes of the sovereign power. And therefore they needed Assad or someone like Assad, and they still do. Now, the Russians are there to stay. This is part of the Russian national security doctrine. The American national security doctrine is like the Russian one in reverse, because the Americans don't want nation building. They don't want to rebuild Syria unless there is something for American contractors financially. But they don't want the burden. They don't want the responsibility. They don't want the casualties. All they want is to be able to declare victory over Daesh, over the Islamic State, and go home.
Dr. Bones?
Well, wars are an expensive business. This is perhaps has helped explain why we hear these declarations of victories time and time again, because at least in a perception, we have gained something. But if you're looking again at the Russian interest, if the Russians would like to stay there, and they do, and they need to create a certain degree of stability. And for that stability, they need to find a way to play between the different players and actors and stakeholders. And in that sense, what the Russians were able to do, since they have entered in 2015, they were there before, but they have really began to tilt the fate of this war. They were able to create a dialogue and an understanding and a series of agreements between all the relevant stakeholders. They were able to speak with the Americans, they were able to speak with the Iranians, they were able to speak with the Israelis, they were able to speak with the Jordanians, they were able to speak with the Turks, and at times they convened some of these partners together, sometimes to the demise of some of the other partners that were not included at that particular point in time. They were able to create a very good mechanism of coordination with Israel, a mechanism that in the last few weeks, following the September episode in where a Russian plane was shot by Syrians, but sort of blamed by the Israeli action that took place at the same time. But that system overall had worked. And therefore, part of what the Russians are trying to do is to make sure that all the partners remain at bay so that they can have this Kaliningrad in the Middle East. For that, they need to make sure that they're able to keep in contacts and that they're able to keep the partners at bay and are able to find the right formula in order to make sure that stability is kept and that their interest can be advanced.
Professor Khanen?
In principle, I would agree with what Nir said, but I will try to have a look at this from probably a little bit different perspective. Theoretically, they are of course interested to have their strong base, Kaliningrad, in the Eastern Mediterranean, with their not just ally but the client regime. On the other hand, Mr. Putin understands that he's unable to invest necessary resources in order to keep it by himself. So please have a look what is going on in contemporary Russia. He's losing his credibility in the eyes of Russian public still. His rating is about something like 60%. However, it's not about 90% that he had 2 years ago. During the recent elections, local elections or governorship elections, the ruling party lost a few very important areas, and those who won victory in this area, there were people who simply they were spoilers, just people who didn't undertake any serious electoral campaign. That was Atzbat Miha, the protest voting, 100% clearly, which means that he should be strong and to play as a strong person, as a strong leader in the eyes of its own public. On the other hand, he is unable to invest necessary resources. So he wants Iranians to be there. Iranians believe that they are not clients of Russia. They are patrons of the Syrian regime, and at least they're talking with Moscow, Begova Einaim, like we say in Hebrew, eyes to eyes. And that means that these impossible relations, and Mr. Putin was updated about that building up relations with Tehran on one hand, and Jerusalem on the other hand, that's impossible relations, like in the Pretty Woman, So from this point of view, as far as I understand the situation, Russians are confused, and they really don't know what to do at the moment.
So you just came back from Moscow, Professor Khanin. To what degree did you feel that there is some kind of shift towards Jerusalem from Tehran, considering what you just said?
Well, I would say that there are two schools. One school of the local commentators, they believe that Israel is finished as a partner. So Russians were pushed to the wall, and now they have to make a decision. Mr. Putin, many years, many months, couple of years, many months, was playing the game that they are building up this relationship with the Tehran and Jerusalem in parallel. At the moment, this school said that, okay, now you have to make a choice. And the choice was made. Mr. Putin is not anti-Semite. He still doesn't want to have a conflict with Israel, but if that's the choice, they prefer Iran. Another school said that this is just by the way conflict. Israel is still able to do whatever they want to do, just not to pronounce it loudly. Please don't tell us that you did it 200 times, so do whatever you need to do, but just don't tell it to all the international media. If you're asking me, I would say that in Moscow, in Kremlin, and in the Smolensk Square and the Foreign Office and the General Headquarters, the final decision is not made, but it will come soon.
Mr. Owen?
Geography is destiny, was said many years ago. And for Israel, Syria is a neighbor, which makes it both a burden and an asset, because it is here. The Israelis are not going to leave Syria to its own devices, while the Iranians, of course, want to reach the Mediterranean through Syria and Lebanon. But for them, there are many other arenas in which they can play. Now, and therefore, while the Russians are using what happened on September the 17th, the shootdown of the GRU, the military intelligence plane, by the Syrians, which, by the way, showed that the Russians do not instruct their pupils properly, because the Syrians studied at the feet of their Russian instructors. They have been using this incident in order to cool their relations with Israel. It was a very, very considered decision, not emotional. They used it. However, once the peace formula regarding Syrian power sharing, but power sharing under Assad, comes into play, the Russians will have to coexist with Israel as a neighbor of Syria. For the Americans, Syria is only half of the geographic entity which the Islamic State has tried to take over, Iraq and Sham. Iraq is part of the picture. For the Russians, it is not. It is not their problem. It is not their business. And the United States partnered with Israel regarding the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and more importantly, Iran in Syria and Iraq. And when the Iranians tried to pull back their missiles and other munitions to Iraq, to the Iraqi desert where they thought it would be out of reach of Israel. Israel has coordinated with the United States. It was given permission. There was never any combat mission undertaken by both the Israeli and American militaries. Up to now, there has not been one such military operation. But there
That
was
is known about.
not even unknown. The powers in both Jerusalem and Washington have been very strict. Contrary to several legends and popular beliefs, there is no combat mission in which Israeli troops and American troops are storming a single target side by side. But on the higher level, on the headquarters level, there is a lot of coordination. And of course, the Americans have let Israel operate in Iraq because it is their domain. Israel would not have dared operate in Iraq without American permission. So if the Iranians thought that Syria is now too dangerous for them to tackle Israel in, and that they can do it safely from Iraq, it turns out that they were wrong.
Dr. Bohms, you've been researching, among others, also the supply routes of Iran through Iraq, as well as Syria and Lebanon. To what degree do you believe that the Iraqi arena is as vital for whatever is happening in Syria as the situation is unfolding?
Well, the Iraq arena has been vital and will remain vital for almost the exact same reason why the Syrian arena remains vital. Because the Iranian corridor, what others have called the attempts to create a Shia crescent that stretches from Iran through a number of land routes through Iraq, through Syria, and all the way to Lebanon, is something that is a part and parcel of the broader Iranian strategy in the region to stabilize a favorable access, also to create political alliances. They have done this successfully in Lebanon, a country that in many ways now has an organ, a militia, a terrorist organization that is actually stronger than the military of the country that's supposed to control it. In Iraq, we have seen a similar struggle of militias and proxies, and in a way, again, East and West alliances and Iranian sides versus sides that are supported by other players that are opposing Iran. And all of that became, at some point, as the Islamic State had in many ways had shown us, really one arena because the borders were erased. So this is all a part of the same ecosystem. And if we're coming back to what the Russians are trying to do, and why I think that the Russian-Israeli coordination mechanism had lasted for a while and probably will last, the Russians do not really need the Iranian influence in Syria. If they want stability, they understand that at this particular point in the game, the Iranians do not have so many friends in the region. And if the Iranians are there to destabilize, and Israel will have to retaliate, as it did a good number of times, the more Iranian presence you will have in Syria, the more responses we will get from the Israeli side and perhaps from the American side. And therefore, if the Russians need an access strategy, if they need stability so they can begin to cash in on some of the results of the war when it comes to gas, when it comes to oil, when it comes to infrastructure and reconstruction, then they need stability. Stability cannot be achieved as long as the Iranians are there.
Professor Khanin?
Well, when the Russians say, or Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, says to Israeli parties that your demand to kick out Iranians from Syrian land is unrealistic, what does he mean? Does he mean that they would very much love to, as Nir said, but they're unable to do it at the moment? Or they actually are not interested to kick them out totally? They want them weaker, but still present there because Russia is unable to invest all necessary resources in order to control the situation and to keep Assad's regime in power. I would say that I would say that the second is more correct, as the later is more correct than the former. Still, what's the next? That's the good question, including the Israeli perspective. Does it mean that Russians will say, okay, now we do everything silent, but we do not mind that you will defend your interests, and here is the red line. Until the red line, we are there. We are with you. But when you cross the red line, as it happened month and a half ago. So we would have to do, and to not just to say, but to do something. Second, that's the question whether this red line is negotiable between Israel and Russia. So at the moment, these negotiations are in progress. What will be the result? At the moment, we don't know. Third, and not so less important thing, you have two approaches in the Russian public itself. One part of the Russian public says, okay, now, Mr. Putin, President Putin, we're very proud of the fact that you took Russia out of up on the knees, and now we are superpowering again. Why shouldn't you invest more resources into their revacha, into their welfare? Yeah, thank you. Into the welfare of the Russian population. Leave Syrians and others to their destiny. We will help, but not to solve all the problem instead of them. Second approach is that, okay, we are there, and we should be there as well in the Sebastopol, in eastern Ukraine, in eastern Moldova, in Georgia, and all other places. So what will be this decision? You ask question, and probably for the first time in this studio, I would say I don't know.
Regarding the Israeli wish for the Iranians to be expelled from Syria altogether, which Professor Hanin brought out regarding the quote from Foreign Minister Lavrov. The agreement, at least for the time being, has been for either 80 or 100 kilometers away from the Israeli border. Now, when you look into what happened in the conversations between the Israelis and the Russians, and you ask why the difference between 80 and 100 kilometers, it turns out that the Russians insisted that the Israeli border is the pre-1967 one, that the 100 kilometers are counted from the Sea of Galilee, which is where the border was marked until the Six-Day War, while the Israelis wanted it to be from the present boundary. All of that goes to show you that Iran is a secondary issue. The Golan Heights, which the Soviet Union at the time and now Russia have guaranteed the Syrians will be negotiated about in a peace for land formula once peace talks resume, which could take from a year to 5 to 10 to an indefinite future. This is still on the agenda. And if the Russians manage to deliver the Golan Heights to the Syrians will be so grateful that the Russian position there will be unshakable.
But do you mean, Amir, that now Russians are ready to expose all these understandings that were between Putin and Netanyahu? They agreed, actually, it was just half a year ago. They again said that Israeli position in the post-war settlement in Syria will be accepted, taken into consideration. An Israeli position that the Golan Heights are on the table. Do you believe that now the game has changed?
You know, in 1975, there was an Israeli-Egyptian second interim agreement in the Sinai.
Right.
Prime Minister Rabin was fearful that this will be a precedent in the negotiations over the Golan Heights. Mm-hmm. So he wanted President Ford to commit the United States not to put pressure on Israel on this very point. What did President Ford promise? He will take Israel's position. He will give it great weight. What does it mean in diplomatic language? Okay, I will consider your position and make my own decision. This sounds like the Russian language.
Yeah, but with all the respect, Moscow is not Washington at the moment.
Far from it, with an economy the size of Italy as opposed to the United States being clearly beyond that.
It's the size of Texas.
Well, this Texas is actually bigger. But we actually are drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement and an analysis for the near future. Dr. Bones, we'll start with you.
There's a new chapter of this war that is beginning. The Syrian uprising has ended. The Syrian war is coming to an end. But the regional war, the war of the proxies, the war between Israel and Iran, unfortunately, I think we are only beginning to see the new chapters of what is about to come.
Professor Hanin?
Well, I think that all the options that were presented here on the studio today, they are open. In fact, even initiators of this or that schemes do not know what will be the end of the game, and probably any subject, any party involved in the process, they are trying to put their red lines and their green lines at the same time. The decision will be probably in the very near future.
Well, I'd actually like to ask you one more question, Dr. Bohms, with regard to Israel. What are the chances that if the Islamic Republic of Iran feels with its back towards the wall, will it ensue to confront Israel from Syria through its Lebanese proxy Hezbollah and establish a full-on confrontation with the Jewish state in such a situation?
It's not going to be an easy thing to do, but all this discourse that we have heard about in the last few months about the third Lebanese war and the fact about a second front, meaning a Syrian front, has to do with all the activity that we've seen in the last few years, including the over 200 sorties towards Syria. Why? Because we've over 22 Iranian bases and more bases that are presumably now are being built in Lebanon. It seems that the Iranians are trying to establish actual power, military power, that has really one objective in mind. With over 200,000 missiles or 130,000 missiles pointing at Israel from Lebanon, and now Hezbollah's operation in Syria, the Israelis obviously fear that very scenario.
Mr. Oren?
As of now, Israel has won its war against Iran in Syria. Now, nothing is permanent. It could change. But as we are speaking, the Iranians have not managed to entrench themselves in Syria against Israel. They have been decimated. They have been pushed back. They may try to reconstitute the forces there, but they are not a threat as of now. Hezbollah obviously is, and Israeli military officials are saying that it is not automatic that Israel will face a united northern front. Israel should not see Syria and Lebanon as constituting a unified threat. It should deal with each on its own. Now, Israel has no problem right now with Syria per se, and the Russian presence in Syria could serve as a stabilizing factor if only the Iranians are out of there. So the prospects are also quite good that if the Iranians are out of Syria, the front will be quiet for a while.
Faisal Khanin, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with that, and I think I would also say that Israel doesn't have a problem with anybody but Iran. And if the scenario as Amir will be on the table and in the field, matov, like we say in Hebrew, what would be the better? I'm not sure that that's the scenario.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Nir Bohms, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Zev Khanin for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you again on Friday at the same time.
Olet juuri katsonut Jerusalem Studio-ohjelman. Mikäli ohjelma oli sinusta antoisa, voit tukea Heaven TV 7 Jerusalemia. Soita 0600 10177 tai käytä ruudun 5 numeroa. Lahjoittaa voi myös PayPalin kautta. Lahjoituksesi mahdollistaa Jerusalem Studion.